At my daughter's wedding, the very wedding I had funded was down to the last flower and bottle of champagne. But when the groom saw me, his smile cracked into anger. He demanded to know why I had come, insisting I wasn't invited. Instead of arguing, I gave him a calm smile and told him I would leave. Before stepping aside, I said there was someone he needed to meet. Someone he already knew far too well. The next moment, his face drained of color, and before the room could understand, he collapsed to the floor. 6 months ago, when Celeste first introduced me to Donovan, I'd noticed how his smile never quite reached his eyes. He had that practiced charm that's salesman perfect after years of closing deals, the kind that makes you check your wallet afterward. But Celeste was radiant beside him, happier than I'd seen her since the divorce. She kept touching his arm, laughing at his stories about his investment firm in Atlanta, about his Emory University connections, about the bright future they'd build together. I wanted to be happy for her. God knows I tried. The way he steered every conversation away from his past, though, made something cold settle in my stomach. It was like watching someone perform a magic trick, all misdirection and sleight of hand, keeping your attention away from what really mattered. The wedding preparations had consumed 5 months and nearly $200,000 of my money. Celeste had insisted on the best of everything, and I'd agreed without hesitation. The dress alone cost $30,000, a creation of silk and lace that transformed my daughter into something ethereal. The flowers, imported from Holland, filled the church with their heavy perfume, almost masking the underlying scent of old wood and candle wax. The reception venue, a historic mansion overlooking Forsyth Park, had been decorated with thousands of tiny lights that would make the evening sparkle like stars had fallen to earth. I'd written every check without complaint, each signature a small attempt to bridge the distance between us that had grown since the divorce. The rehearsal dinner had been the first crack in Donovan's perfect facade. He'd avoided the photographer all evening, always finding reasons to step away just as the camera appeared. When Celeste's cousin brought out her phone for a casual group photo, I watched him physically recoil, his hand moving instinctively to cover the left side of his face, where an old scar ran from his thumb to his wrist. The scar seemed to pulse under the restaurant's warm lighting, a raised white line against his tanned skin. He'd laughed it off, claiming he wasn't photogenic, but his knuckles had gone white where he gripped his wine glass. The crystal looked fragile in his hand, ready to shatter under the pressure. That was the moment I knew my suspicions weren't just paranoia. Something was deeply wrong with the man my daughter planned to marry. Now, standing outside the church, I could hear the murmur of 200 guests inside, their voices rising and falling like waves against the shore. The morning sun cast long shadows through the stained glass windows, painting the marble steps in reds and blues and golds. Inside that church, my daughter stood in her impossibly expensive dress, about to bind herself to a man whose past was nothing but shadows and silence. The weight of what I was about to do pressed down on my shoulders like a physical thing. I wasn't just going to stop a wedding. I was going to shatter my daughter's world in front of everyone she knew, and I could only pray she'd forgive me when she understood why. The wooden doors were heavier than they looked. Ancient oak that had witnessed a century of ceremonies. As I pushed them open, the organ music swelled to fill the space, and 200 faces turned toward me in perfect synchronization. The church was breathtaking, with its soaring ceiling and intricate stonework, flowers cascading from every surface in waterfalls of white and cream. At the altar stood Donovan in his Italian suit, the picture of groom perfection until the moment he saw me. His face transformed from practiced calm to something raw and ugly, like watching a mask slip to reveal the monster beneath. Celeste stood beside him in her wedding dress, a vision of innocence and joy that was about to be destroyed. The silence that followed was complete. The kind that makes you aware of your own heartbeat. Miriam sat in the front row with her new husband, her pale blue dress perfectly coordinated with the wedding colors. Her face showed polite confusion that was rapidly shifting to alarm. The minister had frozen mid-gesture, his weathered hands still raised in what might have been a blessing or a warning. The photographer's camera hung forgotten around her neck as she stared at the unfolding drama. Even the candles seemed to pause in their flickering, as if the church itself was holding its breath. "Why are you here?" Donovan's voice cut through the silence like a blade. "You weren't invited!" The words echoed off the vaulted ceiling, bouncing back at us from every corner. I saw several guests pull out their phones, already sensing this would be a wedding story unlike any other. Celeste's bouquet trembled in her hands, white orchids shaking like they were caught in an earthquake only she could feel. Her carefully applied makeup was already beginning to run as tears gathered in her eyes, creating dark rivers down her perfect cheeks. The contradiction was heartbreaking. The bride, in her moment of triumph, transformed into something tragic. I smiled then, the kind of smile I'd perfected during hostile business negotiations. Calm, confident, and completely devoid of warmth. It was the smile of someone who held all the cards and was about to play them. "I'll go," I said, my voice pitched to carry to every corner of the church. "But first, let me introduce you to someone. A special guest I invited just for you, Donovan, an old friend of yours." I turned toward the side door that led to the church gardens and raised my hand in a beckoning gesture. The door opened with agonizing slowness, afternoon light spilling through like a spotlight on a stage. And then I watched Donovan's face drain of all color, watched his perfect composure shatter, like those beautiful stained glass windows would if someone threw a stone. His legs buckled, and for a moment I thought he might collapse right there at the altar, in front of God and everyone. Whatever he saw in that doorway, whoever was walking toward him through the dancing dust motes and filtered sunlight, it was clearly someone he'd never expected to see again. Someone who could destroy everything he'd built. Someone who knew exactly what kind of monster wore that expensive suit and charming smile. 6 months before the wedding, I received the invitation through certified mail. Not from my daughter, but from Miriam. The cream-colored envelope bore her new married name and a return address in an Atlanta suburb I'd never visited. The paper was expensive, heavy between my fingers, embossed with gold lettering that announced the union of Celeste Marie and Donovan James Mitchell. My own daughter hadn't told me she was engaged. I learned about it from a piece of paper that smelled faintly of Miriam's signature perfume, the same scent that used to fill our bedroom before everything fell apart. I sat in my study for an hour, just staring at that invitation, feeling something cold and heavy settle in my chest like a stone dropped in deep water. The next morning, I made a decision that would change everything. I hired someone to look into Donovan Mitchell. Nothing dramatic or illegal, just basic due diligence, the kind any concerned father might pursue. Within 2 weeks, the gaps were glaring. Donovan seemed to have been born at 21, fully formed with a degree from Emory and a position at a financial firm, but nothing before that. No high school yearbooks, no childhood addresses, no social media posts from his college years when everyone was documenting every moment of their lives. It was as if he'd simply appeared one day, like a character written into existence halfway through a story. Celeste finally called me herself, 3 weeks after I'd received the invitation. Her voice bubbled with excitement about venues and flowers and a dress she'd found that cost more than most people's cars. She talked for 40 minutes about wedding details, but never once mentioned why she hadn't told me about the engagement herself. When I suggested meeting Donovan for dinner, just the 3 of us, she hesitated. He was traveling constantly for work, she said. New York 1 week, Los Angeles the next, always closing deals and building their future. The excuse sounded rehearsed, like lines from a play she'd been practicing. I made appropriate sounds of understanding while something twisted in my gut, a feeling I'd learned to trust after 30 years in business. The investigation deepened over the next month, revealing more questions than answers. The investigator found evidence of a name change in Virginia, but the original name had been thoroughly scrubbed from public records. All that remained were 3 letters from a clerical error in the filing system. D-O-N, Donald something, but the trail went cold after that. It was professional work, the kind of identity erasure that took planning and money and a very good reason to disappear. Normal people didn't go to such lengths to hide their past, unless that past contained something worth hiding. Meanwhile, Celeste threw herself into wedding planning with the intensity of a military campaign. Every phone call brought new expenses to approve, each one more elaborate than the last. Italian linens for the reception tables, a 7-piece band flown in from New Orleans, champagne that cost more per bottle than most people spent on groceries in a week. I approved everything without complaint, writing checks that might as well have been ransom payments for a relationship with my daughter. If Miriam had taught Celeste to see me as nothing more than a bank account, then I'd be the most generous bank account she'd ever encountered. Maybe that would buy me enough goodwill to warn her about the man she planned to marry. The photographer had been my idea, sold to Celeste as a gift to capture every precious moment. What she didn't know was that I'd specifically requested someone who specialized in candid shots, who could catch people off guard when they thought no one was watching. The rehearsal dinner photos were revealing. In every group shot, Donovan had managed to position himself at an angle that obscured his features, always turning at the last second or finding someone taller to stand behind. But the photographer had caught him once, in profile, when he thought he was safe. The scar on his hand was clearly visible, and something in his expression looked hunted, like a man constantly checking over his shoulder. I started noticing other things too, small details that added up to a larger picture. Donovan never talked about his family, deflecting questions with vague mentions of them being estranged. He had no old friends at the wedding, no college buddies or childhood companions. His side of the guest list was filled with recent business associates and casual acquaintances, people who knew him only in his current incarnation. Even his supposed best man was someone he'd met just 2 years ago at a conference. It was as if his entire life before meeting Celeste had been carefully erased, leaving only the polished surface he wanted people to see. The phone call that changed everything came late one night, just as I was considering giving up my suspicions as paranoid delusions. A man's voice, cultured but trembling with barely controlled emotion, asked if I was Celeste's father. When I confirmed, he said something that made my blood run cold. He knew who Donovan really was, knew what he was capable of, and my daughter was in terrible danger. His name was Jasper, and Donovan, under a different name, had been involved with his sister. She'd died 12 years ago, and Jasper had spent every year since trying to prove it wasn't the accident everyone believed it to be. I met him 3 days later in Richmond, Virginia, in a coffee shop that smelled of burnt beans and broken dreams. The man who sat across from me looked like he'd aged a decade for every year he'd been searching for the truth. His hands shook as he pulled out a folder of photographs and newspaper clippings, all centered around a beautiful young woman who'd died too soon. Her name was Eleanor, and she'd been engaged to a man who looked exactly like Donovan, except younger and with different colored hair. But the scar on his left hand was unmistakable, a white line that seemed to glow in one of the engagement photos. Eleanor had been wealthy, isolated from her family by careful manipulation, and had died in a fall-down marble stairs in the mansion she'd shared with her fiancé. He'd been at a business dinner with multiple witnesses when it happened. The death was ruled accidental, attributed to sleeping pills she'd been taking for insomnia that had started shortly after she'd met him. 3 days after the funeral, he'd vanished with $500,000 in inheritance and had never been seen again. Until now. Until he'd resurfaced as Donovan Mitchell, ready to play the same deadly game with my daughter. The coffee shop in Richmond had the kind of worn authenticity that couldn't be faked, with cracked leather booths and a ceiling stained yellow from decades of cigarette smoke before the ban. Jasper sat in the corner, his back to the wall, like someone who'd learned never to let anyone approach unseen. The folder between us might as well have been a bomb for all the destruction it contained. Inside were photos of his sister, Eleanor, newspaper clippings about her death, and a pattern that made my stomach turn. She looked so much like Celeste, it was unsettling. The same blonde hair, the same trusting smile, the same vulnerability that a predator might recognize from across a crowded room. Jasper's story unfolded slowly, like peeling back layers of an onion, each revelation bringing fresh tears. His family had owned hotels along the eastern seaboard, old money that went back generations. Eleanor had been the youngest, protected and sheltered, which had made her an perfect target. The man who'd called himself Dylan had appeared at a charity gala, perfectly dressed and perfectly charming, with a backstory about venture capital and connections that no one had bothered to verify. Within 6 months, they were engaged. Within a year, Eleanor had rewritten her will. 2 weeks after that, she was dead, and Dylan had vanished like smoke in the wind. The isolation tactics Jasper described were horrifyingly familiar. Dylan had slowly convinced Eleanor that her family was jealous of their happiness, that they were trying to control her with their money and expectations. Family dinners became battles, phone calls turned into arguments, until Eleanor stopped coming around entirely. By the time she died, she hadn't spoken to Jasper in 3 months. The last time he'd seen her alive, she'd been thin and anxious, constantly checking with Dylan before she spoke, as if she needed his permission to have opinions. The sleeping pills had started a month before her death, prescribed by a doctor Dylan had recommended. What made my blood run cold was the methodical nature of it all. This wasn't a crime of passion or a moment of rage. This was calculated, planned, executed with the precision of someone who'd done it before and would do it again. Jasper had spent years looking for similar cases, and while he couldn't prove connections, he'd found enough to establish a pattern. Young women with money, complicated family relationships, sudden accidents after quick engagements to men who seemed to appear from nowhere. The names were different, the cities changed, but the story was always the same. Love, isolation, death, disappearance. I showed him what my investigator had found about Donovan, the gaps in his history, the name change in Virginia, the way he avoided cameras like they might steal his soul. Jasper studied the documents with the intensity of someone who'd been looking for these pieces for years. When he saw the 3 letters from the original name, D-O-N, his hands started shaking again. Donald. The same first name as Dylan, Derek, David. Like he couldn't quite let go of that piece of himself, even as he shed identities like a snake sheds skin. It was the kind of detail that might mean nothing, or might mean everything. We spent 3 hours in that coffee shop, building a timeline, comparing notes, watching a picture emerge of a man who used love as a weapon and marriage as a hunting license. Each victim had been carefully chosen, wealthy but vulnerable, isolated, but not so much that their deaths would trigger immediate investigation. The timing was strategic, too, always allowing years between victims, enough time for any investigation to go cold, for any witnesses to forget, for him to build a completely new identity in a different city. He was patient, methodical, and had been getting away with it for at least 12 years. The plan came together over the 4th cup of coffee, bitter and strong enough to make my hands shake, though that might have been fear. We couldn't go to the police with what we had. Suspicions and patterns weren't evidence, and Jasper had already been dismissed once when he'd tried to get the FBI interested. But we had something the police didn't: the advantage of knowing who the next victim would be. If we could expose him publicly, in front of witnesses, in a way he couldn't explain or escape, we might be able to save Celeste and get justice for Eleanor and any others who'd fallen into his trap. The wedding would be our stage, the congregation our witnesses. Jasper would be the ghost from his past, the proof that his crimes hadn't been as perfect as he'd thought. But we'd need to time it perfectly, to ensure he couldn't run, couldn't charm his way out, couldn't turn it around on us. The security team I'd hire would be briefed on the situation, positioned to prevent escape, but not interfere with the confrontation. We'd have 3 months to prepare, to gather any additional evidence, to make sure that when we struck, it would be devastating and final. As I drove back to Georgia, the interstate stretched ahead like a path to an inevitable confrontation. I thought about Celeste planning her perfect wedding, choosing flowers and tasting cakes, never knowing she was planning her own funeral if we failed. The trust fund from her grandmother would vest in 18 months, $500,000 that would make her irresistible to a predator who'd killed for less. Every mile that passed was a mile closer to either saving my daughter or losing her forever. The wedding photos she was so excited about would either capture the happiest day of her life or the moment she discovered she'd been in love with a monster. I started laying groundwork immediately. The security team was hired under the pretense of protecting wedding gifts and managing the high-profile guest list. Hidden cameras were installed during innocent visits to check the venue, tiny devices that would capture everything from multiple angles. I maintained the facade of the supportive father, writing checks and approving decisions while documenting everything, building a case that would be undeniable when the moment came. Every interaction with Donovan was recorded, every conversation analyzed for slips or inconsistencies. The hardest part was watching Celeste fall deeper under his spell. She'd started taking anxiety medication, prescribed by a doctor Donovan had recommended when she'd been stressed about the wedding. She was pulling away from her friends, too busy with wedding planning to maintain relationships that had sustained her for years. Even her relationship with Miriam was strained, as Donovan carefully positioned himself as the only person who truly understood her. I recognized the pattern now, the slow tightening of control that would end with Celeste completely isolated, dependent, vulnerable. We had 3 months to stop it, 3 months to save her, 3 months to ensure the wedding that should have been the beginning of her life wouldn't become the beginning of the end. The next 2 months became an exhausting dance of investigation and deception. Every smile at a wedding planning session, every congratulatory word to Donovan, every check I wrote felt like a betrayal of the truth I was hiding. But the alternative was alerting him to our plans, giving him the chance to disappear again, to resurface somewhere else with another name and another victim. I played my part perfectly, the doting father grateful to be included, while inside I was screaming warnings my daughter couldn't hear. Jasper had found something that changed everything, though we didn't realize its significance at first. Buried in foster care records from Virginia was a placement for a boy named Donald Garrison with a family called the Whitfields. The records were sealed, but Jasper had managed to get a former social worker to talk, someone who remembered the case because of how it had ended. The foster mother had died in a fall down the stairs, and while the teenage Donald had been at a school event when it happened, the social worker had always wondered about the timing. It happened just 2 weeks before an adoption was to be finalized, an adoption that would have made Donald a legal heir to a modest but meaningful inheritance. The pattern was there from the beginning: the methodical planning, the convenient alibi, the strategic timing. If this was true, Donovan had been killing for money since he was 17 years old, perfecting his technique with each victim, learning from whatever mistakes he'd made. The foster mother had been practicing for Eleanor. Eleanor had been practicing for whoever came next, and they'd all been practicing for Celeste. The thought made me physically sick. The idea that my daughter was just the latest in a line of women marked for death by someone who'd turned murder into an art form. I met with Jasper again, this time in a hotel room I'd paid for in cash, paranoid about being followed or observed. We spread out everything we'd gathered, photos and documents covering the bed like pieces of a horrible puzzle. There were more victims than we'd initially thought, though some were harder to confirm than others. A woman in Nashville who'd drowned in her bathtub after mixing sleeping pills with alcohol, something her friends said she'd never do. Another in Charlotte who'd fallen from a balcony during what her fiancé called a trust exercise gone wrong. Each death plausibly accidental, each woman wealthy and isolated, each fiancé mysteriously disappeared afterward. The detail that haunted me most came from the Charlotte case. The victim had kept a journal that her mother found later, filled with increasingly confused entries about forgetting things, losing time, feeling like she was going crazy. Classic gaslighting, but taken to an extreme that suggested something more sinister. Had he been drugging her? Creating the confusion that would make her death seem more plausible? I thought about Celeste's new anxiety medication, the way she'd been more scattered lately, forgetting appointments and mixing up dates. Was it wedding stress? Or was Donovan already laying the groundwork for her eventual accident? We needed more than patterns and suspicions. We needed something that would shock Donovan so completely he'd reveal himself in front of everyone. That's when Jasper mentioned someone from Eleanor's past, a man who'd tried to warn her about Dylan and had paid a terrible price for it. This man had supposedly died in a boating accident 2 weeks before Eleanor's death. His body never recovered. But Jasper had always wondered if he'd actually died, or if he'd run, scared off by threats from someone who'd already proven capable of murder. Finding him would take time we didn't have, but if he was alive, if we could bring him to the wedding, his appearance might be enough to shatter Donovan's composure completely. The investigator I'd hired came through with a lead. Using facial recognition software and database searches that skirted the edge of legal, he'd found someone in Florida who matched the description of the supposedly dead man. Living under an assumed name, working as a boat mechanic, keeping a profile so low he might as well have been underground. Jasper flew down to make contact, approaching carefully to avoid spooking someone who'd been hiding for 12 years. It took 3 days of patient conversation, but eventually the man agreed to help. His name was Christopher, and yes, Dylan had threatened to kill him if he didn't disappear. Christopher's story filled in crucial gaps. He'd recognized Dylan from an earlier encounter in Miami, where a woman he'd known had died under suspicious circumstances. When he'd tried to warn Eleanor, Dylan had confronted him privately, describing in detail how he would die if he continued interfering. The threats were specific and credible enough that Christopher had chosen to fake his own death, rather than become another victim. He'd been living with that fear for 12 years, always looking over his shoulder, never able to reclaim his real life. But the chance to finally stop Dylan, to get justice for Eleanor and the others, was worth the risk of coming out of hiding. We now had our weapon, the surprise witness whose appearance would destroy Donovan's carefully maintained facade. But the wedding was only 3 weeks away, and every day brought new challenges. Celeste was completely under Donovan's influence now, barely speaking to anyone except him, relying on him for every decision. She'd lost weight from the stress, her anxiety medication increased twice, and she'd started having panic attacks that Donovan was always conveniently there to manage. The isolation was nearly complete. The trap almost sprung. We were running out of time. I made one last attempt to reach Celeste directly, suggesting lunch just the two of us, father and daughter like old times. She arrived 45 minutes late, apologizing profusely, saying she'd gotten confused about the time. Her hands shook as she picked at a salad she didn't eat, and she kept checking her phone for messages from Donovan. When I gently suggested she seemed stressed, that maybe they should postpone the wedding until she felt better, she became almost hysterical. Everything was perfect, she insisted. Donovan was perfect. The wedding would be perfect. The word perfect came up so many times it stopped sounding like a word and started sounding like a plea. That night, I called Jasper and told him we couldn't wait any longer. Whatever evidence we had would have to be enough. Christopher was ready to fly in for the wedding. The security team was briefed and positioned. The cameras were in place. In less than a week, we'd either expose a serial killer or destroy my relationship with my daughter forever. There was no middle ground, no safe option, no way to protect Celeste without risking everything. The wedding would happen exactly as planned, except for the moment when the past Donovan thought he'd buried would walk through the church door and destroy him in front of everyone. The morning of the wedding dawned clear and perfect. The kind of southern spring day that made you believe in second chances and happy endings. I stood in my hotel room, adjusting my tie with fingers that wouldn't stop trembling. Everything was in place. Jasper was waiting nearby. Christopher had arrived the night before. The security team was positioned throughout the church. The hidden cameras were recording, silent witnesses to whatever was about to unfold. 3 months of planning, 12 years of Jasper's obsession, and my daughter's life all came down to the next few hours. The church looked magnificent in the morning light, its white stone glowing like something out of a fairy tale. Flowers cascaded from every surface, their perfume so heavy it was almost suffocating. Guests were arriving in their finest clothes, excited to witness what they thought would be a beautiful ceremony. Miriam looked elegant in pale blue, her new husband beside her, both of them blissfully unaware that this wedding would become something entirely different from what they expected. The photographer was already at work, capturing candid moments that would soon become evidence in a criminal investigation. I found Celeste in the bridal suite, surrounded by her bridesmaids like ladies-in-waiting attending their queen. She was breathtaking in her wedding dress, the silk and lace transforming her into something otherworldly. But underneath the perfect makeup and carefully styled hair, I could see the exhaustion, the anxiety that had been building for weeks. Her hands shook slightly as she adjusted her veil, and she kept asking everyone if everything looked perfect, if she looked perfect, if the day would be perfect. That word again, perfect, like a mantra against disaster. We had a moment alone when the bridesmaid stepped out, and I took my daughter's hands in mine. They were ice cold despite the warm morning. I wanted to tell her everything, to warn her, to grab her and run from this place before it was too late. Instead, I told her I loved her, that I'd always love her no matter what happened. She smiled, thinking I was just being sentimental, not knowing I was apologizing in advance for what I was about to do. She hugged me, careful not to wrinkle her dress, and for a moment I held my little girl again, the one who used to trust me to keep her safe from monsters. The organ began playing, calling everyone to their places. I walked Celeste to the back of the church, where she would wait for her cue to begin the procession. Donovan was already at the altar, looking every inch the perfect groom in his Italian suit, but I could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his eyes kept scanning the crowd as if looking for threats. He sensed something was wrong, but couldn't identify what. The minister stood ready with his book of ceremonies, about to perform a ritual that would never be completed. I didn't take my traditional place at Celeste's side. Instead, I walked down the center aisle alone, my footsteps echoing in the sudden silence that fell over the congregation. Donovan's face changed as he watched me approach, confusion shifting to alarm, and then to rage. By the time I reached the altar, his mask had slipped completely, revealing something ugly and dangerous underneath. The congregation was frozen, 200 people holding their collective breath as they witnessed something unprecedented, a father interrupting his own daughter's wedding. "Why are you here? You weren't invited." Donovan's words exploded into the silence, his carefully cultivated accent slipping to reveal something rougher underneath. Every phone in the church came out, everyone sensing they were witnessing something extraordinary. Celeste stood frozen in the doorway, her bouquet trembling in her hands, her face a canvas of confusion and growing horror. The photographer never stopped shooting, documenting every second of Donovan's transformation from charming groom to cornered animal. "I'll go," I said, my voice carrying to every corner of the church, pitched perfectly for the recording devices hidden throughout the space. "But first, let me introduce you to someone. A special guest I invited just for you, Donovan, an old friend of yours." I gestured toward the side door, and it opened slowly, dramatically. Jasper stepped through first, his face carved from stone, carrying a folder that contained 12 years of investigation. The gasp from Donovan was audible throughout the church. He stumbled backward, catching himself on the altar, his face cycling through colors like a twisted kaleidoscope. "No, you were gone. You were supposed to stay gone." The words came out, strangled, desperate. Nothing like the smooth voice that had charmed my daughter. Jasper walked forward with measured steps, his eyes never leaving Donovan's face. Behind him, Christopher emerged from the shadows, and Donovan's legs gave out completely. He would have fallen if he hadn't grabbed the altar for support. Two ghosts from his past, two men who could destroy everything he'd built, standing before him in front of everyone who mattered. Jasper's voice was steady as he addressed the congregation, explaining who he was, who Eleanor had been, how she'd died. He pulled photographs from his folder, laying them on the altar like tarot cards predicting doom. Eleanor in life, beautiful and trusting. Eleanor in death, broken at the bottom of marble stairs. The resemblance to Celeste was undeniable, and I saw recognition dawn on faces throughout the church. This wasn't just a family drama. This was something far darker. Christopher added his testimony, his voice growing stronger with each word. He'd been Eleanor's friend, had tried to warn her about the man she was planning to marry. He described the threats Dylan had made, specific and terrifying enough to make him fake his own death rather than become another victim. For 12 years he'd been hiding, watching from afar as Dylan became Derek, became David, became Daniel, and now Donovan. Always the same pattern. Always targeting vulnerable women with money, always disappearing after their convenient accidents. The transformation in Donovan was complete. The charming mask was gone, replaced by something feral and desperate. His hand went to his jacket pocket, and I tensed, ready for violence. What he pulled out was a knife, small but wickedly sharp. Before anyone could react, he grabbed Celeste, pulling her against him with the blade at her throat. Her bouquet fell to the floor, white orchids scattering across the marble like bones. The congregation erupted in screams, some trying to flee, others frozen in shock. But the security team was ready, moving into position, blocking exits, containing the situation. "Nobody leaves until I say so," Donovan snarled, all pretense of sophistication gone. But his hand was shaking, the knife trembling against Celeste's throat. He was trapped, surrounded by witnesses and evidence, his past and present colliding in a way he'd never anticipated. This was the moment I'd planned for, the public unmasking that would save my daughter's life. But I hadn't anticipated the knife, hadn't considered that cornered monsters sometimes strike out in desperation. The knife changed everything. What had been a controlled confrontation became a hostage crisis in the span of a heartbeat. The blade caught the light from the stained glass windows, throwing rainbow reflections across Donovan's face like a twisted kaleidoscope of colors that had once blessed countless unions in this sacred space. Celeste's eyes found mine across the chaos, wide with terror and betrayal, silently asking how her wedding day had become a nightmare. The security team held their positions, trained professionals who knew that one wrong move could end in tragedy. The church had become a stage for the final act of a drama, 12 years in the making, and the congregation of 200 guests had become unwilling witnesses to something they'd never forget. The silence was absolute, the kind that makes you aware of every small sound. I could hear Celeste's rapid breathing, see the pulse fluttering in her throat just inches from the blade. The smell of the wedding flowers, those expensive orchids and roses I'd paid for, now seemed cloying and funeral, mixing with the sharp scent of fear sweat that filled the church. Several guests in the back rows had tried to leave quietly, but the security team had gently but firmly blocked the exits. We couldn't risk Donovan panicking if he thought people were escaping to call for help, though several phones were already recording everything, their small red lights like eyes in the darkness. I kept my voice calm and steady, though my heart was hammering against my ribs so hard I was sure everyone could hear it. My mouth was dry as sand, but I forced the words out clear and strong. "You won't hurt her, Donovan. Because if you do, everyone here will know about all of them. Every woman you've killed, every life you've stolen, every family you've destroyed." The words hung in the air like an accusation written in smoke. I pulled out my phone slowly, carefully, showing him that everything was being recorded, streamed, documented. The small screen showed the recording app, the timer counting up second by second, capturing his transformation from groom to monster. There was no escape, no story he could spin, no identity he could shed to start over. This was the end, one way or another. Donovan's hand trembled where it held the knife, and I could see the war playing out on his face. Part of him wanted to run, to disappear like he'd done so many times before, but he was trapped by 200 witnesses and cameras recording from every angle. The confident man who'd charmed my daughter was gone, replaced by something cornered and desperate. His expensive suit was soaked with sweat, the Italian fabric clinging to him like a second skin. The scar on his left hand seemed more prominent now, pulsing with his rapid heartbeat, a mark of violence that we'd all overlooked in our blind trust of his perfect facade. That's when I played the recording that changed everything. I'd been saving it for this moment, the nuclear option that would destroy any chance he had of talking his way out. An old woman's voice, weak but clear, filled the church through my phone's speaker. The acoustics of the sacred space amplified her words, making them echo off the vaulted ceiling like a confession from beyond the grave. She described watching a teenage boy push his foster mother down the stairs, the sound of the woman's neck snapping like a dry branch, the way the boy had stood at the top of the stairs for a full minute, just watching, making sure she was dead. She'd been too frightened to speak up at the time. A poor immigrant housekeeper whose word would mean nothing against a grieving foster son with an alibi. The congregation gasped collectively as the recording continued, the old woman's voice growing stronger as she unburdened herself of 20 years of guilt. She named names, dates, places. The foster mother who'd been planning to adopt him, who'd changed her will to include him, who'd discovered something about his past that made her reconsider. She'd called her lawyer the morning she died, the old woman said, planning to remove Donald from her will. By evening, she was dead at the bottom of her own staircase, and Donald Garrison was crying convincingly at the hospital while secretly calculating his inheritance. It had been his first murder, the template for all that followed. Margaret Whitfield, whose initials M.W. had appeared in records Jasper had found, whose death had funded Donald's transformation into Dylan, then Derek, then all the others. The recording included details that had never been in any police report, things only the killer and this hidden witness would know. How Margaret had grabbed for the banister, and Donald had kicked her hands away. How she'd called his name as she fell. Not in anger, but in disbelief that the boy she'd tried to save was killing her. How Donald had walked down the stairs afterward, stepping over her body to use the kitchen phone to call 911, his voice already perfecting the panicked grief he'd use again and again over the years. The old woman had hidden in the pantry, terrified, waiting until he'd left with the ambulance before fleeing and never returning to that house of death. Donovan's grip on the knife loosened as the recording played. His face had gone gray, the color of old ash, his eyes unfocused and glassy. He was seeing not the church, but perhaps all the women he'd killed, all the lies he'd told, all the lives he'd destroyed. Eleanor falling down those marble stairs, her neck at an impossible angle. The woman in Nashville drowning in her bathtub, bubbles rising from her lungs as he held her under. The one in Charlotte plummeting from her balcony during what he'd called a trust exercise. All of them trusting him, loving him, dying for him. The knife fell from nerveless fingers, clattering on the marble floor with a sound like breaking bells, like the chimes of a clock striking the final hour. The sound broke whatever spell had held Celeste frozen. She pulled away from him, stumbling toward me on legs that barely held her weight. Her wedding dress tore where he'd gripped it, the expensive silk ripping with a sound like a scream. I caught her in my arms, feeling how violently she was shaking, holding her as she sobbed against my chest. Her perfect makeup ran in rivers down her face, black mascara mixing with foundation to create a mask of tragedy. The tiara in her hair had come loose, hanging at an angle that made her look like a broken doll. I could feel her heartbeat against mine, rapid and frightened, but alive. Wonderfully, beautifully alive. The security team moved in swiftly, professionally, their movements coordinated like a dance they'd rehearsed. 2 of them restraining Donovan as he stood there like a broken puppet with cut strings, 3 others creating a protective barrier around Celeste and me. The lead officer, a retired detective I'd specifically requested for his experience, began reading Donovan his rights in a clear, steady voice that cut through the chaos. The words echoed in the church, mixing with the sounds of crying and shocked whispers from the congregation. Several people were openly weeping, whether from relief or horror, I couldn't tell. Donovan looked at me with eyes that held nothing but defeat. The kind of complete surrender that comes when every lie has been exposed, every mask torn away. "How long have you known?" he asked, his voice hollow and strange, like it was coming from the bottom of a well. The question seemed to matter to him. This detail of when his perfect plan had started to unravel. I told him the truth, that I'd suspected from the beginning, from that first dinner when his smile never reached his eyes. I'd started investigating the day after learning of the engagement. Every moment since had been leading to this, his public destruction in front of witnesses who could never be silenced or dismissed. The police arrived within minutes, their sirens having been silent to avoid alerting him too soon. They filled the church with uniforms and procedure, transforming the sacred space into a crime scene. Yellow tape appeared like twisted wedding ribbons. Evidence bags collected the knife and other items. Photographers documented everything with the same dedication the wedding photographer had shown just minutes before. They took Donovan away in handcuffs, the metal clicking closed with a finality that echoed through the church. He had to walk past all the guests who pressed back against the pews, as if evil might be contagious, as if his touch might spread the darkness that lived inside him. As they let him out, he turned back once, his eyes finding Celeste where she stood supported between Miriam and me. What I saw in his face might have been regret, or maybe just rage at being caught, at having his perfect record broken by a father's love and a brother's persistence. The morning light through the church doors backlit him for a moment, creating a silhouette that looked like nothing more than an empty suit, which perhaps was all he'd ever been. Then he was gone, loaded into a squad car that would take him to face justice for crimes spanning 20 years, though justice seemed like too small a word for all the pain he'd caused. The church emptied slowly, guests unsure how to process what they'd witnessed. Some offered confused condolences to Celeste, not knowing what else to say when a wedding becomes an arrest. Others fled without a word, eager to escape the contamination of such darkness. The minister stood at his altar, looking lost and older than his years, as if evil had contaminated his sacred space, and he didn't know how to cleanse it. He'd later tell me he performed a special blessing that night, trying to restore sanctity to a place where such wickedness had been revealed. The photographer had documented everything, creating a record that would be studied and dissected for years to come, evidence in a trial that would captivate the nation. But in that moment, all that mattered was my daughter, alive and safe, even if her heart was broken into pieces too small to count. She stood there in her ruined wedding dress, the train torn and stained, her bouquet abandoned somewhere in the chaos. The morning she'd woken up as a bride full of hope, and now she stood in the wreckage of every dream she'd built with a man who'd planned to kill her. The cognitive dissonance must have been crushing, the whiplash from joy to horror enough to break anyone's mind. Jasper approached us carefully, moving like someone approaching a wounded animal. His 12-year quest was finally complete, but there was no triumph in his face, only a deep sadness for all the waste, all the lost years, all the women who hadn't been saved. He thanked Celeste, strange as it might sound, for giving him the opportunity to get justice for Eleanor. She listened numbly, her mind clearly struggling to process everything that had happened. Then she did something unexpected that made everyone who witnessed it cry. She hugged him, this stranger who'd lost his sister, and they stood there in the ruins of her wedding, two survivors of the same predator, finding comfort in shared grief. They held each other while the abandoned wedding flowers wilted around them, their perfume now smelling like funeral wreaths. Christopher added his own quiet words of comfort before disappearing into the morning, finally free to reclaim his life after 12 years of hiding. He shook my hand before he left, his grip firm and grateful, and I saw in his eyes the weight of all those years of looking over his shoulder, of jumping at shadows, of living as a ghost because a killer had marked him for death. He could go home now, wherever home was, and use his real name again. The boating accident that had never happened could finally be corrected in official records. He could live without fear for the first time since he'd tried to warn Eleanor about the monster she was planning to marry. As the church finally cleared, just Celeste, Miriam, and I remained among the scattered flowers and abandoned decorations. The wedding programs lay strewn across the pews like discarded dreams, Donovan and Celeste's names printed in gold letters that now seemed to mock us. Miriam approached me slowly, and for the first time in years, there was no hostility in her eyes, only gratitude mixed with horror at how close we'd come to losing our daughter. She thanked me for saving Celeste, for being the father our daughter needed even when she'd pushed me away, even when Miriam herself had poisoned the well between us. We stood together, united in relief, and the shared understanding that our petty divorce grievances meant nothing compared to almost losing our child. The altar looked wrong somehow, decorated for joy, but now witness to such darkness. The unity candle stood unlit, the sand ceremony containers untouched, all the symbols of joining two lives together now meaningless. Celeste looked at it all with eyes that seemed decades older than they'd been that morning. "How long?" she asked in a broken whisper that barely sounded like her voice. "How long before he would have killed me?" Based on the pattern, I told her gently but honestly, probably within a year. After the honeymoon phase ended, after she'd updated her will to include him, after he'd isolated her completely from everyone who might ask questions. The trust fund would have been his reward for another perfect murder, $500,000 for perhaps 6 months of performance. She nodded slowly, understanding finally that my betrayal had been salvation, that destroying her wedding had saved her life. that sometimes love looks like cruelty when it's keeping you alive. 3 months later, Celeste and I sat in the same coffee shop where I'd first met Jasper. The afternoon sun slanted through the windows, creating patterns on the worn wooden table that looked like the bars of a cage we'd both escaped from. The coffee tasted better now, richer somehow, without the bitter edge of fear that had flavored everything during those terrible months. The circle felt complete, ending where the salvation had begun. She looked healthier than she had in months, the haunted look finally leaving her eyes, color returning to cheeks that had been pale with stress and medication for too long. The therapy was helping, she said, her voice stronger now, learning to trust again, to recognize the warning signs she'd missed or explained away in her desperate need to believe in perfect love. The ring had been the first thing to go. She'd sold that 2-carat diamond engagement ring and donated every penny to a domestic violence shelter downtown, transforming a symbol of false love into something that might actually save someone else. The director of the shelter had cried when Celeste explained where the money came from, understanding without words that this was more than a donation. It was an exorcism, a way of turning poison into medicine, darkness into light. Celeste had started volunteering there twice a week, sharing her story with women who knew what it was like to love someone dangerous, to mistake control for care, isolation for intimacy. The trial had been swift and decisive, though sitting through it had been like reliving the nightmare in slow motion. The courtroom had been packed every day, media and victims' families filling every seat, all of us bound together by Donovan's trail of destruction. Faced with overwhelming evidence and multiple witnesses, including video footage from the wedding that had gone viral online, Donovan had eventually confessed to everything. 6 confirmed murders over 20 years, possibly more, that would never be proven. He'd sat there in his orange jumpsuit, looking smaller somehow without his expensive suits, and shown no remorse, only a cold curiosity about how he'd been caught. The judge, a woman with silver hair and eyes that had seen too much evil, had sentenced him to life without parole, ensuring he'd never hunt again. The families of his victims had wept openly when the verdict was read, finally getting justice even if it couldn't bring back their loved ones. Jasper had been there every day of the trial, sitting in the same seat, bearing witness for Eleanor and all the others. We'd grown close in those difficult weeks, bound by a strange brotherhood of almost loss and narrow escape. He'd started seeing a therapist, too, learning how to live without the obsession that had driven him for 12 years. The last time we'd spoken, he'd mentioned maybe writing a book about it all. Not for money, but as a warning, a guide for recognizing predators who hide behind perfect smiles and practiced charm. I told him I'd help however I could, that Celeste's story deserved to be heard if it could save even one person from a similar fate. "Dad," Celeste said, reaching across the table to take my hand. Her fingers were warm now, not the ice cold they'd been on her wedding day. "Thank you for never giving up on me, even when I pushed you away, even when Mom poisoned me against you, even when I chose him over you." Her hand was steady now, the trembling finally gone, the anxiety medication no longer needed. I squeezed back, feeling the calluses on her palm from the boxing classes she'd started taking, learning to defend herself, to never be vulnerable again. I thought of all the wedding photos that would never exist, replaced by crime scene photographs and evidence folders, prosecutors' exhibits and newspaper clippings. But she was here, alive, rebuilding her life piece by piece, like a mosaic made from shattered glass that somehow caught the light more beautifully because of its broken edges. The wedding dress had been burned in what Celeste called a cleansing ceremony, just the two of us in the backyard of my house on a clear October night. We'd watched $30,000 of silk and lace turn to ash and smoke, the intricate beadwork popping in the flames like tiny fireworks. She'd stood there in jeans and an old sweatshirt, looking more beautiful than she had in that dress. Because she was free. The venue deposits were lost. $20,000 gone with nothing to show for it. The flowers had died within days, their beauty rotting in the summer heat. The 7-tier cake was never cut, probably thrown away by the confused catering staff. $200,000 spent on a wedding that became a crime scene, a fortune exchanged for 15 minutes of horror. But every penny was worth it, every dollar a down payment on my daughter's survival, because she was sitting across from me, alive and healing, with a future stretching ahead of her that Donovan would never darken. Miriam had called me last week, the first time we'd spoken without lawyers present in 5 years. She'd apologized, for the years of poison she'd dripped into Celeste's ears about me. The near loss of our daughter had shaken something loose in her, made her realize that her bitterness toward me had almost cost Celeste everything. We'd never be friends again, too much water under that particular bridge. But we could be better parents, united in our gratitude that our daughter was still breathing, still laughing, still able to sit in coffee shops and plan a future. Her new husband had even shaken my hand at the trial, thanking me for doing what he never could have seen coming. The man who'd been painted as the enemy for so long had become the hero of the story, though the hero felt like too strong a word for someone who'd simply loved his daughter enough to see through the perfect mask. As we prepared to leave the coffee shop, Celeste asked the question I'd been dreading since that horrible day in the church. Would you do it again? Knowing how much it would hurt me, how it would humiliate me in front of everyone I knew, would you still destroy my wedding? The question hung between us like the ghost of the future she'd almost had. The life that would have ended at the bottom of some stairs or in a bathtub, or wherever Donovan had planned to stage her accident. I didn't hesitate, couldn't hesitate, because the answer was carved into my bones. Yes, I told her. 1,000 times yes, 10,000 times if necessary. Because that's what love looks like sometimes. Not gentle and kind, but fierce and protective, willing to cause pain to prevent death, willing to be hated to keep someone breathing. She nodded, understanding finally that being a father sometimes means being the villain in your child's story, to keep them alive, to write the next chapter, the next year, the next decade of a life that almost wasn't. Sometimes the monsters wear the most perfect masks. Trust your instincts, investigate the silence, and remember that love, real love, sometimes looks like betrayal when it's keeping you alive. Thank you for listening to my story. If you were in my position, what would you do? Please share your thoughts in the comment below.